Hey, let's do an intro to Anthony B. Pinn and his book Varieties of African American Religious Experience in light of the progress of our course so far. So you can find a nice intro here, a nice bio on Anthony Pinn if you just Google his name. This is his page there at Rice University. And if you remember from the first little video I made in class, I've done some work with Dr. Pinn with our special issue on hip hop and religion. He and Monica Miller, who is a name you're likely to hear if you keep your eye on interesting cultural stuff happening in the realm of African American studies, they both edited the papers. I kind of solicited them. They did the work, and then I actually got to review each of the articles in there too. So anyway, that's Anthony Pinn, a remarkable and important scholar of our time. So what I'd like to cover right now is really three questions. Where have we come from? What does our selection of texts tell you about this course's methodology? Where are we going with Pinn? We've done our 2 quests. You finished your big paper. We've got a 3rd quest to go. What are we doing? Let's get our feet under us. History of religions is an interdisciplinary field drawing from philosophy, psychology, sociology, cultural studies, history, cognitive studies, and anthropology, and more, to develop a picture of the power of religious identity at the level of the individual as that individual moves in the world and makes sense of their place in the world. To put it bluntly, people are living and dying for their religious identities, and we need an interdisciplinary method in order to grasp the breadth and the depth of the power of religious lives. Our definition of religion in this class comes from Charles Long, boiled down to one sentence. Religion for our purposes means, quote, orientation in the ultimate sense, that is, how one comes to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in the world. And that's from Significations, page 7. This deceptively simple definition turns conventional wisdom on its head regarding what is or is not the data of religious studies. We are no longer social scientists putting boxes over people and places to say, hey, this is religion. See, it's happening in a church. Must be. Or that person, she's wearing a fine hat and attending church on Sunday, so she's religious. That kind of a notion of there would be categories and one could define whether or not what was happening was religious according to whether or not it fit the category. So we've turned that on its head. Rather, we've taken on the responsibility of interpreting data more broadly available in culture, with which we can make arguments regarding the reason people everywhere have some basic patterns that tie them all together as humans. We analyze the repetitive patterns with which people make meaning out of their most important and most powerful experiences, and argue that these are best understood as their religious practices. So our texts have been interdisciplinary. Not only did we read Equiano's slave narrative, but we also read scholars who analyzed the text from different fields, Sahlers, Gates, and Dykes. Why? What happens to your appreciation of the text when you've read Gates's literary discussion on the trope of the talking book? Right? This isn't an English department. What happens and why would we read Gates on the trope of the talking book in a religious studies class? Why read Dykes' discussion of the humanitarian philosophies that were brewing in Equiano's time? How do we come out of this interdisciplinary perspective on a slave narrative more able to identify the depth and breadth of the power of religious identity at work in the text. Next, we read historian of religions Yvonne Choureau, who presented us with evidence about slave religion as it was lived on the plantations, and how a careful study of those practices revealed that slaves were building an alternative moral universe in which they drew from the more abstract promise of freedom they found in the Bible, with the more pragmatic exercise of magic to help protect them from the horrors of subjugation, exploitation, and dehumanization. Then, we read the essays of an interdisciplinary genius who wove together a psychology and sociology of the color line. The essay format allowed Du Bois to speak eloquently of his personal experiences, but he wove that narrative into some of the most comprehensive and important study of Reconstruction ever accomplished by academics. His use of the word souls indicates to us that while he was firmly grounded in theories of psychology and economics, he nevertheless guided the reader on the landscape of religious identity. Where his people had suffered the experiences of dehumanization, he titled his book with a re-sacralization of their full humanity. He's talking about the souls of Black folk. That means they are elevated from their dehumanized position, elevated onto the landscape of proper religious identity, humans with souls. With James Cone, we headed into theology, but not in order to become seminary students training in the hermeneutics of Protestant theology. Rather, we use Cone's theology to learn the rules of theology. It requires the writer to identify sources and norms with which humans of limited knowledge address the power of divine activity. That's how theologians have set the ground rules. So, like any game humans have ever invented, the game of theology comes with rules and referees so that the game is played fairly and in terms of humans wishing to discuss. Let me put a sentence break there. In terms of humans wishing to discuss God, that's a game where the stakes are very high, and the rules and referees have been developed over millennia. When we read Cone, we not only learn about the souls of Black folk in the 60s and 70s, right? And in that way, he's a continuation. He's giving us a pulse in the 60s and 70s compared to Du Bois at the turn of the century. But we also learn the rules by which theologians engage in their talk about God. So as students in a religious studies class, it was important to learn that theology has a set of rules. You'll be able to analyze in the future when you hear people speaking theologically. You'll be able to think in terms of yourself, what kinds of sources, what kinds of norms is this person using? But we are not in a seminary. So you might be wondering, why is Keller having us read another theologian as our final quest? Here's why. As we read Pinn's information about non-Christian religious traditions in America today, we get to do so also looking at a question of ultimate significance. How does each particular tradition look at the problem of evil? As he notes, each of these traditions in America is a result of the African diaspora, and hence each of these traditions has had to contend with the power of violent subjugation and dehumanization, so that each has had to ask the question, where do I stand with regard to the evil with which I must live daily? Right? You got to make sense out of it when you are on the receiving end of evil. There's no way to make sense of your position if there is creative theological power, a divine creator to which you could appeal, and you've ended up on the wrong side of the color line. You've got to deal with the problem. What is my significance? So Pinn sets up his study of these traditions in 2 steps. Firstly, he's going to give you a brief but adequate description of the history and doctrine of each tradition. The quiz is going to be hard because he fires through with a whole new set of vocabulary for each of these traditions. We're going to try to learn enough about each that you leave here with a 3,000 level appreciation of this element of African American religious culture, a 4,000 level, right? So first, the adequate picture. Secondly, he's going to establish a comparative frame between the traditions in order to ask, how do each of these traditions provide their members with a narrative about the meaning and response to evil in the world? In this way, he is again functioning like a historian of religions rather than a theologian. He is not preaching to you about why Yoruba traditions have the answer about the meaning of evil. Rather, by comparatively studying how each tradition deals with this theological problem, he develops an analytical frame with which we can grow in our appreciation of the work that each of these traditions does for its followers. That work is to help them determine the ultimate significance of their place as African Americans against the context of the evil that was visited upon them as a people. So the theology does work, and by looking at how it treats evil, we can watch how does this particular tradition do work for the people involved. How does it help them to make sense of their place? Now, bonuses for you. He shares in the methodology that is used in this course and defines religion using Charles Long and a guy named Kaufman so that we are still on the same playing field with which we began this course. Activities and practices with which people determine the ultimate significance of their place in the world are the data for Pinn's selection of these traditions, including humanism. And since humanism, if you can recall from Catherine Albanese, she says, not all people live with gods, but all people stake a claim on the landscape of identity. And in this way, we can understand they're staking that claim as part of the work of religion. And you'll see how he walks that. You'll see whether you find that compelling. As you read his intro, you will hear echoes that are consistent with our studies so far. He talks about Long and Thoreau. You'll see that Kaufman is heavily influenced by Long's approach. And these resonances with our earlier work will help you to understand and master the methodology, aided by his articulate and effective description of his methodological purpose and process. So, where we've come from, our interdisciplinary approach, and how to place this religious studies professor who raises a theological question in a comparative framework as he studies non-Christian, contemporary African American religious life. I hope you found